I never imagined that the walls I once called home could turn into the very place where my heart fractured. It did not begin with shouting or slamming doors, but with a slow shift, a small change in tone, a quiet dismissal, a signature I never wrote. Pain does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it slips in disguised as family, comfort, and trust. The day I realized I was no longer seen as a loved one, but as an obstacle was the moment everything inside me cracked. This story is not just about loss, it is about awakening. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Linda Carter, and I am 68 years old. I live alone in a quiet, weathered house near the edge of Charleston Bay, where the wind carries both the scent of salt water and the gentle echo of seagulls gliding above the docks I once served as a high school principal, spending decades trying to guide young minds toward integrity, courage, and kindness. My life was built on discipline, responsibility, and the belief that family is the deepest form of security given to us on earth. My home is not simply a structure. It is a living testament to 3 decades of shared labor between me and my late husband, Robert, who worked as a ship carpenter. It carries a history shaped by scraped savings, stubborn hope, and the slow brushing of paint over new boards under humid southern air. Every corner holds something he touched, and every door creaks in a tone that reminds me of his easy laughter. The wooden floors have never been replaced, and the windows still wear the same white frames we installed together one cold autumn morning. The front porch is my sacred place. From there, I can see the silver line of sunlight reflecting on the water whenever the morning breeze lifts the fog. The old swing on the porch still rocks even without anyone sitting on it, as though Robert finds a way to remain present. The house may look aged, but every imperfection is a reminder of a memory we earned rather than bought, which makes it more valuable than anything with a price tag. Life after Robert passed away has moved slowly. My days are filled with small routines that help me stay anchored. I walk beside the bay every morning, moving at a steady pace while listening to the water tap against the rocks. Then I sit at my usual coffee spot near the harbor, where the owner does not ask questions and simply understands that a quiet morning can be healing. I return home with a calm mind, tend to my garden, and trim flowers that grow stubbornly near the fence line. In the afternoons, I care for my plants, bake when I feel inspired, and sometimes write small reflections in my journal. During the evenings, I join a group of women from the local church where Pastor Tom encourages fellowship, prayer, and honest conversation. There is comfort in familiar faces and gentle voices. When I return home at night, I move slowly through the rooms, grateful that silence no longer frightens me. I have 2 children. Emily, my daughter, lives in Seattle, Washington, and built a life there according to her own idea of fulfillment. We once disagreed about which choices were wise, and that distance between us grew into something deeper than miles. My son, Ethan, lives closer and has always been viewed as the person who would someday watch over family matters. He is married to Megan, who works in digital content creation for lifestyle and home design. She is energetic and modern, and though we are different, I try to understand her world. I am not lonely, only carefully quiet. I protect this home because it represents my entire life. I believe that memories deserve respect, and no matter what happens in the future, this house is my final chapter, not the beginning of someone else's ambition. If you're still watching, and this story already has your heart racing, comment number 1 below. so I know you're here. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The afternoon light spilled across the wooden floor like a familiar greeting, and I believed for a moment that everything in my world was still steady. I moved quietly through the living room, dusting the shelves where framed photographs rested unchanged for years. I tried to keep every object exactly where it had always belonged, because I believed a house should remember the hands that shaped it. The air felt slightly different that day, not colder or warmer, simply altered in a way that I could not fully name. A few new objects sat near the fireplace that did not belong to my rhythm of daily life, including a camera tripod and a ring light that faced the sofa like an unblinking eye. Megan had been recording short home videos recently, but I thought it was just another passing trend, something that would fade as quickly as it appeared. The clink of equipment being moved around became a normal background noise, though it did not match the quiet nature of the house that I guarded like a final promise. She walked from corner to corner, adjusting decorations for what she called a perfect background, while I attempted to remain invisible, unsure of how to behave around someone who saw my living room as an unfinished set. When she began speaking loudly to an unseen audience, I paused near the doorway and listened without intending to. Her voice was bright, polished, and rehearsed. She told viewers she was excited to share life from what she referred to as our Charleston home. The word "our" struck me like a sudden drop in temperature, the kind that takes a breath before the mind understands why my hand tightened around the cloth I was holding. This house, the one purchased for decades of sacrifice, did not feel like a shared claim simply because they were staying here temporarily. I reminded myself that young people sometimes choose words carelessly, and I tried to believe that it meant nothing more. Later that week, I overheard Ethan talking loudly on the phone from the porch. He spoke with a tone that mixed frustration and anticipation, and he used the phrase, "Once we refinance the house, everything will loosen up." My heart lurched in confusion. He spoke as though he had full legal control, as though the place I cherished was a financial tool. I returned to my chair and attempted to breathe evenly, repeating a silent reminder that worry was not evidence, that children sometimes dream aloud without understanding consequences. At church that Sunday, Pastor Tom preached about letting go of possessions that tie us to outdated versions of ourselves. He encouraged generosity and reminded us that holding too tightly to material things could prevent spiritual peace. His message was gentle, but it echoed inside my chest longer than it should have. I wondered if I was slowly becoming the kind of person who loved memories more than life itself. When I returned home, I noticed small but meaningful changes. The floral curtains Robert helped me hang had been folded and replaced with lighter, modern ones. Several framed photographs were no longer on display. My bedroom door became a place where Megan stood one evening, smiling softly before she commented that it would make a perfect future nursery. The casual assumption behind her words settled into my mind like a warning. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to unfamiliar echoes. The house felt like it was shifting ownership, not through paperwork, but through vocabulary, decoration, and future planning that did not include my presence. A quiet fear opened inside me, subtle but unmistakable, and I sensed that the peace I had built was standing on borrowed time. If you're still watching and feeling that something is not as innocent as it seems, comment number 2 below to show you're following every detail. It's time for Chapter 3. The morning began with the same calm rhythm that had guided me for years. I woke before the sun lifted fully above Charleston Bay, breathing in the early air that drifted through the slightly cracked window. I moved to the kitchen to prepare my usual cup of coffee, enjoying the quiet drip of the machine while I watched a thin layer of mist float over the water. The day ahead seemed simple and ordinary. I planned to visit the farmer's market to buy fresh berries and then stop by to see my neighbor, Marjorie, who always enjoyed a slow afternoon conversation. I felt steady, unaware that everything around me was about to shift like a floorboard giving way. While the kettle warmed and the smell of roasted beans filled the room, I hummed softly, trying to hold on to the peace that accompanied moments without noise or interruption. Then I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and purposeful, not the casual movement of someone coming to greet a loved one. When I turned, Ethan stood in the doorway with an unreadable expression. His shoulders looked tense, his jaw tight, and his eyes avoided mine as if preparing for something he did not want to witness. Before I could ask if he had slept well, Megan walked in behind him, holding a thick folder pressed firmly against her chest. There were no morning greetings, no smiles, no warmth. Instead, the room suddenly felt colder, as though an unseen door had opened to let in the wind. Megan placed the folder on the kitchen table with a controlled motion and looked directly at me with an expression that felt both practiced and final. She spoke slowly, clearly, and without hesitation, telling me to gather my belongings because I would be moving out that very day, followed by a declaration that they were taking over the house. The sentence did not sound like a mistaken moment of frustration or a careless choice of words. It was deliberate, rehearsed, and spoken with certainty. My mind rejected the statement before it could settle into understanding. I asked what she meant, not because I thought I misheard her, but because I needed time for reason to find its footing. She repeated the same words, identical in tone and pace, leaving no room for reinterpretation. Ethan finally stepped forward, offering what he seemed to believe was justification. He explained that they had arranged for a senior living apartment, describing it as more suitable for someone my age. He spoke about safety, convenience, and health services nearby, making it sound like an act of responsibility rather than displacement. Megan then slid the folder toward me, revealing several documents. I recognized formal formatting, legal terminology, and signature lines. There was a property management authorization granting Ethan full control and refinance paperwork that transferred financial authority. I stared at the signatures printed in smooth ink, identical to my own handwriting. A quiet chill ran through me when I realized the date matched the period when I had been in the hospital recovering from a severe respiratory infection. At that time, I barely had the strength to hold a spoon, let alone sign legal documents. My voice remained steady when I said I had never signed anything. Megan and Ethan kept their expressions firm, acting as if the matter was already settled. In that moment, the walls of my home felt tighter, and the air that once carried comfort now tasted metallic and sharp. I saw not only betrayal, but calculation, a slow approach disguised as help and family unity. I felt my heart tighten, not from physical pain, but from a deep rupture of trust. I stood still, holding the table for balance, allowing silence to stretch long enough for awareness to settle. Something inside me shifted, not loudly or violently, but with controlled strength. Beneath the shock, humiliation, and grief, a thin line of resolve began to form, steady and alive, like a root pushing through the hardened soil. If you're still watching and sensing that the situation is about to spiral, comment number 3 below, so I know you're ready for what comes next. Let's continue with chapter 4. When the echo of their footsteps faded and the house fell into a heavy quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the folder that had been placed before me like a sentence already written. The papers lay open, still smelling of printing ink, each sheet whispering a threat I had never imagined would come from my own child. The air around me felt sharp, as though the walls themselves were questioning what had just happened. My hands were trembling, but inside my chest something shifted from disbelief to a controlled, anchored awareness. I understood that fear would not save me. Silence would not save me. Only action carried a chance of survival. I inhaled slowly, then closed the folder and rested my palms on top of it, feeling its weight like a physical stone. I reminded myself that people under pressure must think clearly rather than emotionally. Instead of pacing or crying, I reached for the old wooden file box that belonged to my late husband, the one where he kept every important contact from his years of work and life planning. It was tucked inside the linen closet behind folded quilts. I found the name I remembered, Harold Bennett, the attorney who had helped us finalize the home purchase so many years ago. His number had never been removed because we trusted him as someone who respected both ethics and loyalty. The call connected, and though my voice wavered slightly, I explained only the essential facts. I described the documents, the sudden demand, and the date of the signature that aligned with my hospitalization. His tone changed immediately, and he instructed me to come see him privately. I agreed without hesitation. To avoid causing suspicion, I did not call a taxi service or request help from my son. Instead, I walked to my neighbor Marjorie's home and asked whether she could accompany me to town. I kept the explanation simple, saying that I needed to review property documents and preferred company. She agreed without pressing for details, which made the ride feel safe. Harold's office smelled of paper, ink, and cedar furniture, the same as it had when Robert and I first walked through the door nearly 3 decades earlier. His eyes narrowed when he examined the documents and compared the signature to a sample from my identification card. He studied the date with visible concern. He asked detailed questions about my health condition, physical state, and memory capability at that time. When I confirmed that I had been extremely weak, disoriented, and unable to sign anything, I saw his professional focus sharpen. He tapped the papers lightly and began listing legal concerns that included identity misuse, signature fraud, and intentional exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He then contacted the bank manager responsible for the refinancing file, requesting procedural proof and verification records. The initial response was distant and evasive. Insisting that everything had been processed properly, Harold did not accept this answer. After repeated insistence, the bank agreed to release security footage from the signing day. When the video file arrived, we watched it together in silence. The woman signing wore a cap, large sunglasses, and a mask, making identification difficult. Her posture, height, and hand movements carried an unsettling familiarity. The bank employee in the video rushed through the process, skipping several required verification steps due to recognizing the family name. Harold leaned back in his chair, his expression no longer simply concerned but steeled with certainty. He informed me that what we were witnessing was not a misunderstanding, but a coordinated act that potentially involved multiple parties, including bank negligence. He instructed me to remain calm at home and continue normal behavior so no one suspected professional intervention. As I walked out of his office, the world looked clearer than it had that morning. I felt a quiet strength rising within me. Like steady fire, I no longer saw myself as someone being pushed out. I saw myself as someone preparing to fight for what was rightfully mine. If you're still watching and beginning to feel the tension growing deeper than expected, comment number 4 below to stay on this emotional journey. Next, we move to chapter 5. The late afternoon sun filtered through the living room windows, casting warm stripes of light across the floorboards as Ethan and Megan returned, speaking loudly as though the house had already become a renovation project rather than a home still occupied by its rightful owner. They carried notebooks, interior design catalogs, and measuring tools, discussing paint shades, floor replacements, and the idea of removing the porch swing altogether to make room for what they called a modern outdoor seating concept. I stood silently near the kitchen doorway, watching the 2 people who once shared meals and holidays with me behave like investors surveying a newly acquired asset. Inside my chest, a quiet storm raged, but my face remained calm. I had learned that when dealing with people who already believed they had won, silence could be sharper than accusation. However, I could not let the afternoon end without addressing what was true and unspoken. I stepped forward, asking a steady, clear question regarding the signed documents and the circumstances in which they were obtained. The room went still, but only for a beat. Their reactions arrived quickly, wrapped not in fear or remorse, but in annoyance and defense. Ethan leaned back against the counter with crossed arms, saying I was overthinking and should simply accept help during old age. Megan smirked as though my confusion was entertaining, claiming that I misunderstood the situation due to emotional fragility. She spoke slowly, giving the impression that I needed information fed to me, like a child struggling with comprehension, making it clear she saw herself as intellectually superior. She hinted that older people often misremember things, implying that my confusion might not be circumstantial, but cognitive. Ethan chimed in with complaints from years ago that he had never voiced, suggesting that I had been difficult, impossible to satisfy, and ungrateful for the sacrifices he believed he had made. His words came not from logic, but from resentment that had never been addressed or resolved. I realized then that betrayal did not always grow overnight. Sometimes it sprouted quietly, watered by entitlement and silent blame. When I reached for the folder that once lay openly on the table, I discovered it was gone. Megan casually mentioned that she had placed it somewhere safe because she believed it belonged to adults who understood legal responsibility. Her voice held an artificial sweetness that thinly covered her intent. She walked away with firm confidence, closing the door to the guest room they used as a temporary office and locking it without hesitation. A few hours later, I heard familiar video recording tones echoing from the living room. I moved quietly to the hallway and listened as Megan recorded a carefully crafted message for her followers online. She presented a false narrative, portraying me as stubborn, difficult, and unable to adapt to the needs of family progress. She framed their actions as a loving intervention rather than calculated possession. In minutes, she had altered public perception with a single post. Comments began appearing, expressing sympathy for her and criticism toward me, written by strangers who felt bold behind screens. My heart tightened as I read messages that described me as selfish and unaware of how to support the next generation. Within a single afternoon, betrayal had expanded beyond legal matters into the destruction of dignity and identity. However, instead of collapsing, something within me crystallized into resolve. I walked outside to the porch, the place that had always grounded me. The wind lifted strands of my hair, and I looked out at the shimmering water where time seemed slower and truer. I understood that battles were not won by the loudest voice or the fastest lie, but by the one who held truth long enough to present it when timing became undeniable. In that moment, the fear inside me transformed into something steadier than anger, deeper than pride. I did not simply want justice. I needed to reclaim the story of my own life. That night, long after every room in the house had gone silent, I lay awake in the dark with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling where shadows shifted with every passing car outside. The wind coming from Charleston Bay rattled the loose screen on the window, creating a soft but persistent tapping sound that matched the rhythm of my thoughts. My body felt heavy, yet my mind moved restlessly, circling the same questions I could not escape. I wondered if I had reached an age where life stopped offering choices, or if this moment was meant to prove that choices never truly disappear as long as one refuses to surrender. I began to lay out every possible path in my mind, forcing myself to be brutally honest. The first option was to walk away quietly, allow them to take the house, and accept the senior living apartment arranged without my consent. It would bring immediate peace, remove the conflict, and protect my remaining years from exhausting battles. But the thought of sitting in a room that did not belong to me, while someone else lived through my memories, felt like being erased before death even arrived. I knew that if I chose that path, a part of my spirit would never recover. The second option was to pursue a full legal battle. Harold had already confirmed the strength of my case, and the seriousness of the violations that had occurred. Facing them in court could expose the truth and restore both dignity and property rights. Yet the cost of such a fight would not only be financial or physical. I would have to endure months, perhaps years, of confrontation, media pressure, emotional attacks, twisted narratives, and relentless manipulation from the people I once called family. I asked myself whether victory would taste the same if it required destroying the thin remains of a bond I once believed unbreakable. Then came the third possibility, the one that carried both strategy and patience. I could remain silent on the surface, move gently, act normally, and give no sign that I already knew the truth and possessed legal support. I could gather additional evidence, observe without reacting, and prepare a plan that could not be undone by impulsive emotion. Silence, when used wisely, was not surrender. It was preparation. As these thoughts layered over one another, I found myself questioning not only what needed to be done, but who I wanted to be in the final chapter of my life. I remembered the personal code that Robert and I built our lives upon: dignity before comfort, truth before convenience, and never allowing wrongdoing to disguise itself as practicality. I sat up slowly in bed, feeling as though his voice, though absent, still shaped the unseen air around me. When I rose to get a glass of water, I noticed a small wooden chest on the top shelf of the linen closet. It had belonged to Robert, sealed since the day he passed, because I had not yet found the strength to open it. Something inside told me it was time. I pulled it down carefully and sat on the floor, my hands resting on the familiar grain of the wood. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was the original house contract and a handwritten letter stating his intention that the property remain solely under my lifelong ownership, with any transfer requiring full legal witness and signed consent. My breath caught, not from surprise, but from the profound reassurance that fate had not abandoned me. I closed the chest with steady hands and understood that the battle would not be fought through rage, but through quiet preparation and lawful truth. Before dawn, I stood by the window and looked toward the water where the horizon was beginning to lighten. I whispered a promise into the stillness, not with despair, but with strength resurfacing like a tide returning to shore. I would not be removed from my own life. I would choose the path that required courage, not surrender. If you're still watching and can feel the turning point approaching, comment number 6 below to show you're not giving up. Now, let's move into chapter 7. The morning light arrived without warmth, sliding across the floor in pale streaks that felt more intrusive than comforting. I rose slowly, feeling the stiffness in my joints and the heaviness layered within my chest. After hours of restless turning, my body felt fragile, as if every muscle had spent the night fighting battles that had no physical form. I walked into the hallway expecting silence, but instead I heard the muffled voices of Ethan and Megan from downstairs, speaking with a casual certainty that made it clear they no longer saw me as part of the home, but rather an obstacle they assumed would soon disappear without further resistance. When I entered the kitchen, I noticed that many of my belongings had been rearranged without consultation. The coffee mugs I used daily were pushed into the back of the cabinet, and the familiar ceramic teapot Robert once gifted me was gone from the shelf. The refrigerator space that once held my groceries now displayed labeled containers that belonged to Megan's content creation meal plan. Without saying anything directly, they were claiming territory, drawer by drawer and shelf by shelf, as if pushing me gradually toward the edge until I stepped out of the picture myself. Ethan hardly looked at me when he passed by with a notebook in hand, scribbling measurements for future renovation plans. Megan told me that from now on, the kitchen would mostly be used for filming, and that I should prepare my meals in the small microwave inside the laundry area to avoid interrupting her schedule. The comment was spoken with an artificial politeness that sounded like a warning disguised as a courtesy. A quiet tension wrapped around me, pressing into the space where my voice might have lived, yet I remained silent, not out of defeat, but strategy. Over the next few days, access to shared areas narrowed even further. The living room became a filming zone. The dining table turned into a workspace for sponsorship packages, and the small back room, once a storage space, was suggested as a place where I could keep most of my personal items until things settled. The pressure grew so gradually that each step might seem inconspicuous to an outsider, but to me, it felt like I was becoming a ghost inside my own home. My sleep grew shallow and broken. On some nights, I felt my heart beating too fast for someone lying still. My hands occasionally trembled when I folded laundry or poured a drink, and I kept a bottle of blood pressure medication in my pocket instead of in the bathroom because I no longer trusted privacy. Even small tasks, such as holding a spoon or buttoning a collar, reminded me that stress has a way of settling into the bones of older age, moving silently but decisively. Meanwhile, messages arrived on my phone from distant relatives and former colleagues, many expressing concern, but laced with subtle judgment. Some wondered if perhaps age had made me overly protective. Others hinted that letting go of the house for the sake of my son might be admirable. It was clear Megan's online narrative was spreading farther than expected. I no longer knew if anyone believed my version of the truth, or if they assumed my silence was proof of confusion rather than strategy. One afternoon, while searching for storage boxes in the garage, I found an open package addressed to an online buyer. Inside was Robert's watch, the one he received after 25 years of service at the shipyard. The engraving on the back confirmed there was no mistake. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I felt the world shift beneath me. The grief I had managed for years through careful ritual turned into a fierce tightening that did not resemble sorrow, but awakening. That night, I sat alone near the window, holding the house key that had remained unchanged since the day we moved in. The small metal piece pressed into my palm felt like a vow I did not break. I did not bend. I only became quieter, and in that quiet, sharper. The next morning arrived not with dread, but with an unexpected steadiness. I woke before dawn and sat upright without hesitation, sensing something inside me had shifted overnight from grief into clarity. The house around me felt unfamiliar, yet my mind finally felt aligned with purpose. I reminded myself quietly that emotion would not win this battle. Strength would come from preparation, evidence, and patience. I stepped into the bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror, noticing the lines of exhaustion near my eyes, yet also a quiet determination that had not been visible before I understood that any attempt to reclaim what was mine would require not only endurance, but also strategic calm. I began my day by organizing a small notebook I had found in my dresser drawer. It was small enough to be hidden easily, yet sturdy enough to hold pages of facts and timelines. I wrote the date at the top and recorded every detail I remembered about the fraudulent paperwork and the events that followed. I then discreetly photographed areas where evidence of control and property intrusion was visible, including the locked office door, the rearranged kitchen, and the missing sentimental items. I also opened my phone voice recorder and placed it on silent mode, preparing to gather audio if degrading remarks were made again. Each step felt like reclaiming a small piece of power that had been stripped away. Later that morning, when Megan was occupied filming, I quietly searched for traces of the listed items that had recently disappeared. I found screenshots of online listings in a folder on the shared computer, confirming that Robert's watch was not the only object sold. Several antiques from our early marriage, including a handcrafted wooden jewelry box, had also been listed with descriptions that exaggerated their age to draw higher profit. I photographed these listings, saving them to a concealed flash drive that Harold had advised me to keep outside the home. After securing everything, I contacted Harold again, using a calm and steady tone. I updated him on the evidence collected and explained that further emotional manipulation and property interference were ongoing. He encouraged me to continue documenting quietly and advised that the time to reveal everything would come later, not in sudden confrontation. The reassurance gave me a renewed sense of confidence. Next, I walked to the church to find Pastor Tom. I asked whether we could speak privately, not for legal help, but to establish a record of emotional and psychological distress through someone respected by the community. He listened carefully as I explained only facts, without anger or tears. He offered to document my state in his pastoral records and promised he would be available to testify about my mental clarity if needed. In the afternoon, while walking by the harbor for air, I encountered a woman named Sarah, who recognized me from photographs Megan had once shared online. She mentioned that she used to know Megan well through college organizations and that their group focused on image building, sponsorship negotiation, and strategic public perception. She spoke carefully, hinting that Megan had previously been investigated for unethical collaboration actions. Sarah offered to help if needed, explaining that truth matters more than online narratives. Her willingness felt like a rare light in a tunnel of shadows. Returning home, I gave one copy of the flash drive to my neighbor Marjorie, asking her to keep it safe without explaining full details. She agreed without question, proving that trust does not always require explanation, only history. That evening, I practiced breathing exercises and wrote in my journal while reading the handwritten note from Robert that confirmed his intent for lifelong ownership. His words became my anchor. Looking at my reflection again before bed, I saw not a victim waiting for removal, but a woman preparing to reclaim her story with patience and proof. If you're still watching and ready to see how everything finally unfolds, comment number 8 below and stay with me until the very end. Up next, the conclusion. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heavy stillness that felt different from every previous day. I woke before the alarm and sat up slowly, letting the air settle inside my lungs. The house remained quiet, perhaps more silent than ever, as if it sensed that judgment was finally approaching. I dressed carefully in simple clothing that made me feel steady rather than fragile. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see a victim returning to reclaim what was taken. I saw a woman presenting herself not to fight, but to stand for the truth she had protected through patience and restraint. Outside, the sky held a gray tint, with thin clouds drifting in stretched forms, as if the world itself understood that some truths require solemn weather. Harold met me at the courthouse entrance, offering a nod that meant readiness rather than encouragement. His presence reminded me that although I had walked through emotional darkness alone, I was no longer standing without allies. When we entered, Ethan and Megan were already seated, both appearing confident, even slightly impatient. Megan wore an expression that suggested she expected praise for her decisions, while Ethan looked tired but stubborn, unwilling to consider that his actions might have consequences beyond convenience. The hearing began with formal procedures and documented submissions. Harold presented the case with measured language, listing the charges and the supporting evidence: identity misuse, intentional deception, unauthorized financial activity, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and illegal sale of personal items. He placed each document and time-stamped file before the judge, building the narrative not through emotion, but through undeniable proof. The video from the bank was played, revealing the disguised woman signing documents while the employee skipped multiple verification checks. The room tightened with quiet surprise, and the bank representative lowered his gaze when questioned. Next came the handwritten letter from Robert, stating lifelong ownership and the requirement of verified legal presence for any transfer. The letter carried emotional weight, but more importantly, it carried legal authority. After that, Images documented the online sale of personal belongings, confirming clear property violation. The recordings that followed shared the tone of coercion, establishing that pressure had been used rather than agreement. When Sarah testified, explaining Megan's history with manipulative tactics, a visible shift occurred in the atmosphere. Even Ethan's expression faltered for the first time, revealing confusion that seemed closer to dawning regret than confidence. The judge reviewed each document carefully, then asked for statements. Megan insisted on defending her actions by framing them as family progress and modern living standards. Ethan attempted to justify decisions as protective measures. Their reasoning, however, dissolved beside the recorded facts, legal documents, and testimonies that showed not misguided love, but strategic personal gain. The final decision returned full legal ownership of the home and belongings to me. Compensation for damages was required, and both Ethan and Megan were ordered to vacate the property immediately. The bank was instructed to provide corrective action and restitution for procedural negligence. When we left the courtroom, I did not feel triumph. I felt a quiet exhale that released months of suffocation. Outside, the sky had lightened, but the wind still carried a cool edge. As Ethan collected his bags that evening, he avoided my eyes, perhaps because apology required a depth he was not ready to reach. Megan left quickly, holding her phone tightly, already planning a new story for someone else to believe. I walked to the porch swing at dusk and sat down slowly, letting the wooden seat move under my weight. I placed my hand on the railing, feeling the memory of Robert within its grain. The house no longer felt threatened. It felt returned. The days after the judgment carried a calm I had not felt in months. The house felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the weight that once filled every corner was finally gone. I moved slowly from room to room and allowed myself to feel each space again, as if I were meeting an old friend who had survived a long silence. I opened windows that had been shut for too long, letting fresh air push away every memory that did not belong. Sunlight, once blocked by dread, returned without resistance, settling softly on the furniture and photographs that still held meaning. I spent mornings reorganizing shelves, not to erase the past, but to restore intention. Cleaning became an act of healing rather than duty. I placed Robert's belongings back where they once stood, not as monuments to grief, but as gentle reminders of shared time and authentic love. In the afternoons, I walked along the shoreline not to escape, but to breathe. I slowly rebuilt habits I had abandoned, such as journaling, stretching, and reading before bed. Each action reminded me that survival alone was not enough. I needed to live again, consciously and carefully. Facing my emotions was harder than facing the legal battle. I accepted that the deepest wound did not come from documents, signatures, or property loss, but from the realization that betrayal can come from those we raise with love. I learned that generosity without boundaries becomes easy terrain for manipulation, and silence can be misinterpreted as weakness. I no longer felt shame for trusting, but I promised myself that trust would never again be given without protection. With time, I created a new plan for my life. I registered for a photography class, contacted a travel group for adults, and signed up to volunteer for an organization supporting elderly victims of financial exploitation. I no longer wanted to dwell on what had been taken, but to use it as fuel for what could still be built. One evening, as I sat on the porch swing, the same one where I once feared losing everything, I felt a quiet conviction pain had shaped me, but it did not define me. I was still here, and that was enough to begin again. Life does not always break loudly. Sometimes it changes direction through quiet moments of clarity. When trust is betrayed and comfort turns into uncertainty, the heart learns what strength truly means. Pain is not proof of failure, and loss is not the end of love. Healing begins the moment we choose truth over silence, dignity over approval, and boundaries over blind sacrifice. Hope is never destroyed by those who hurt us. It grows from what they could not take. Every ending, no matter how heavy, carries a hidden doorway to a new beginning, built from wiser choices, calmer faith, and deeper self-respect. In the end, the most valuable wealth is peace. The most powerful defense is clarity. And the greatest victory is becoming whole again. Thank you for watching this story. If it touched you, please share your thoughts and personal reflections below. Do not forget to follow, like, and subscribe for more meaningful stories.